Morning, everyone, those that are gathered here and those that are watching via live stream. Today I'll be offering just a brief introduction to this Gospel of Mark, one of my four favorite Gospels. They're all favorites. A little bit about the author of this Gospel. It's believed that Mark is the one that is known as John Mark, and then mentioned in the New Testament. John being his Jewish name, and Mark, they believe, is his Latin surname. And so they say that this is referenced in Acts chapter 12, verse 12, when Peter, after he's released from prison, comes to the house of Mark's mother, and Mark is staying there, and he refers to him this way. Some also say that he went with Paul on his first journey or missionary journey, that he was a cousin of Barnabas, who also accompanied Paul in his missions. And then too, some will say, and this is probably a little more closer to what most theologians will agree upon, that he was a companion, the Apostle Peter. And even references, Peter does, him as being somewhat of a spiritual son in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13. I don't want to bog down with the historical details of Mark, but I like what Jesuit theologian Father Just simply says, is that Mark was not one of the apostles or an eyewitness to Jesus' ministry, but a second-generation Christian, and most likely a follower of the Apostle Peter. In fact, one of the early church fathers, Pius, a bishop of Hierapolis, who was around about 60 years after the resurrection of Jesus, had said this about Mark. Having become an interpreter of Peter, he wrote down accurately, though not indeed order, whatsoever he remembered of the things done or said about Christ. For he neither heard the Lord or followed him, but after he followed Peter. I'll give you the backdrop here just to help us to realize that gives us a little bit insight to Mark's credibility as a gospel evangelizer. He's believed to be the first writer of the Gospels, coming around, I would say 40 to 50 years after the resurrection of Christ. Matthew and Luke followed with their Gospels, and they're believed to be around 60 years after the resurrection of Christ. And then John, the final Gospel, was believed to be around 90 to 100 years after Christ. And it's also said that Matthew and Luke had borrowed some of the events and accounts that were recorded in Mark's Gospel. As we look at the Gospels, there's some things that kind of are evident to us. And Matthew's Gospel is always directed to more of a Jewish audience, and Mark, we understand, is addressing more of a Roman Gentile audience. If we are looking at the study of who Christ is, we can kind of get a sense of how the other gospel writers present him. And so Matthew starts his gospel with a long genealogy, if you recall. Abraham, the father of Isaac, Isaac, the father of Jacob, and so on, all the way down to Joseph, the husband of Mary. It was of her that Jesus, called the Messiah, was born. Again, Matthew making this connection to those of his audience and really forcing the Jewish roots here. So we call this a Christology from below, or low Christology. So right away, Matthew is introducing who Jesus is from a very human perspective. He's one of us. He's one of us. If we fast forward to John's Gospel, we say that comes from a high Christology, or Christology from above. And so we're familiar with the beginning of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word was in God, its presence, and the Word was God. And a few verses later we hear how this Word was made flesh. Again, Christology from above. Now both Matthew and John incorporate the other aspects of Jesus. Human fully, yes. Divine fully, yes. We started different approaches, though. Mark, in his gospel, although he starts at the very beginning, identifying Jesus kind of as the Messiah here, he, I think, skillfully weaves in continuously throughout this whole idea of the divine and the human, how Jesus was fully one, and they're sprinkled throughout to bring forth, I think, this understanding constantly and reminder in our minds. And I'll touch on that in a little bit here. And then we come to beginning. And it's setting up the whole scene, I think, or theme for Mark's gospel. We hear of prophet Isaiah talking about a message to make ready the way of the Lord. And then immediately he jumps into John the Baptist as this messenger. Jesus comes down and is baptized by John. As he comes out of the water, the Spirit descends on him like a dove, and a voice from heaven, "You are my beloved Son, on you my favor rests." Then, this is immediately followed by 2 verses recalling Jesus being led into the desert by the Spirit, where Jesus was put to the test by Satan, and then the angels waited on him. Then next, right after this, we jump right into Jesus' ministry and the call of the first disciples. This actually sets the tone, even though it's only about 20-some verses and we hear all of this stuff. It sets the tone for what this gospel is about, his theme. And it's twofold. First, he wants to put forth that this Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And the second is that Jesus is worth following immediately. And if we watch closely or read through this gospel, how fast-paced it is, and how the action and movements of the gospel keep reiterating this fast. This happens, and this happens, and this happens, and so there's immediacy continuing all throughout. You recall even last week, or 2 weeks ago, we had in our gospel, we're listening to Gospel of Mark this year, Jesus visiting Simon Peter's mother-in-law who's ill, and so Jesus heals her, and then the immediately she gets up and waits on them. Then after this, Jesus is healing others, and so the next morning he's out praying. His disciples go out to him, and they say, "Hey, come back in. People are looking for you." And Jesus says, "I must be about my Father's business." Immediacy again being brought forth here. We're given all of this, again, within the first 22 verses of the gospel, this theme. So we look for this being come forth as you read through the Gospel of Mark. Not only the actions and events being told, but the movement and the connections of these movements, sometimes shifting from one to another. Mark is very, very fast-paced. He doesn't waste time. He's very straightforward in what his message needs to be. Again, coming back to that, Jesus is the Son of God, and that he's worthy of following immediately. All of the first disciples, they drop everything and go. There's a whole lot of things I could discuss regarding Mark's gospel, but that would take several sections, so I just want to unpack a few of them for you this morning. I mentioned the connectedness of Jesus' divine and human nature being fleshed out throughout Mark's gospel. References Jesus as using terms of Son of God, and the phrase as beloved Son when Jesus comes out of the water in baptism. Holy One of God, or Son of God, and Son of the Most High are often mentioned by those demons that Jesus casts out at different times. And then Mark again comes back to this very human nature when he uses the word Son of Man, a term that Jesus uses to describe himself. And I think cleverly Mark is putting these things in here, intentionally or moved by the Spirit, to have us understand Jesus fully divine and fully human. Son of David, as professed by the blind beggar on the side of the road. Pay attention to the characters that Mark uses in the gospel to describe Jesus. We hear words like teacher and prophet and rabbi or rabboni, which means our great one, as Peter calls Jesus a couple of times, and so does Judas when he betrays him. And then I would say, rather cleverly, Mark has offered us a powerful actions of Jesus in the healing of the leper, the blind, the paralytic, the man with the withered hand, raising Jairus' daughter from the dead, feeding the 5,000, walking on water, calming the wind, the stormy sea, casting out demons, and on and on. But if you look closely through these events, you'll see he has very human emotions in his reactions. Sometimes he's angry. Sometimes he's frustrated. Sometimes he's moved with pity. And two, some of the movements that take place with one of the literary devices that Mark often incorporates, that be telling a story within a story, or having something happen in the midst of something else going on. The healing of the paralytic. It should be a glorious moment. This is something that is very important, but also wonderful that's taking place here. Lower body, or the paralytic, into Jesus, and so he's healing this person. A wonderful thing. And yet, in the middle of all this, what does Mark place? The scribes, challenging Jesus' authority. Right in the middle of all this success. And then, too, when he sends out his apostles on their mission, go forward. Another wonderful moment as we're eagerly waiting to hear back what happens and all that they've done. That takes place in his gospel, but before then, throws something else in there, the death of John the Baptist. How often do we find ourselves embracing a wonderful experience, and then something happens that we're forced to shift gears? Be a joyous occasion, a baptism or a wedding, be a job promotion, be a number of things, and then a related state, and then all of a sudden we hear perhaps some bad news. We're almost screaming out, why? Why can't you just enjoy this moment? Can't we be embracing of it? Why does this have to happen? A priest friend of mine had shared with me recently, it was for him kind of like being embracing of a special spiritual moment with family whose member was dying, all that were present, and how he could just feel the Spirit moving there and the prayers that they lifted up. Not only the person dying, but the family that was present there. Special moment, he said. And then he told a little while later how worthless he was by someone he was called to serve. That being followed by ministering to someone dying with COVID and being enriched by their faith and the peace that awaits them. He explains it's certainly a moment the Spirit was present. It's a crazy world sometimes, but nothing compared to what Jesus experienced, which was magnified 100-fold, for he was both human and divine. Throughout Mark's gospel, he pushes forward the themes that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that Jesus is worthy of following immediately. There is hesitancy, as Mark brings forward, especially in the first half of his gospel and maybe up to the three-quarter point. Pushback. Misunderstanding or lack of understanding by Jesus' followers. There's pushback by the Jewish authorities, which lead to rejection and eventually Jesus' crucifixion. This tension that Mark posits is being brought forth many times. Again, it's this not only story within a story, but how he sometimes keeps coming back to the same thing. Do we get it? Do we get it? Many times that Jesus heals, casts out demons, and they acknowledge who he is. Peter, with question, says, "You are the Messiah, Son of God." This they call the Messianic Secret, because after each time these events take place, what does Jesus say? Tell no one. Tell no one. You see, the reason behind that, not 100% sure. Many will say that is because already Jesus has a hard time getting into cities because of the crowds, and they don't want him to be seen as just a miracle worker. And you fully understand who this person is, the Son of God. But even as apostles struggle to hear that, to understand that. Here's the kicker. We know who Jesus is, that he is worthy of following immediately. Mark's gospel brings this to light at the end of the gospel in Jesus' passion, and his death, and his resurrection. Take a look even at last week's gospel, if you recall, the healing of a leper, someone who was outcast because of his disease. That is who Jesus came for. The outcast, the leper, the sinner. The great irony is that Jesus, the one who came for outcasts, himself had to get out of town. In fact, there are several times that Mark tells us of Jesus not being able to openly go into any town. He had to stay outside in places where nobody lived. Sense very much outcast. Today, I would say that there are times that he is still outcast. Outcast from our public schools or public buildings, outcast in the workplace. Just try to profess the good news of Christ in the public or at work or even among friends and see how fast you are moved outside the inner group. Even at the end of Jesus' ministry on earth, where do we find him? Outside Jewish walls, hanging on a cross. Do we still keep him there? At a distance in our lives, perhaps calling upon him only when we need him. We'll close just a little bit with, if you read the Gospel of Mark, the ending is a bit unusual. There are different endings, a longer ending and a shorter ending with a freer logium. Although these are all pieces of different manuscripts of the Gospel found later and added, longer being traditionally accepted by the canonical part of the Gospel at the Council of Trent, I like to think that we who come to know through Mark's Gospel as well as the other Gospels and the New Testament writings that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that he is worthy of following immediately. The ending of the Gospel then becomes us. We're the ones who by our ministry complete the story within a story that Mark has told. Again, I encourage you as you read through the Gospel of Mark to take time to check out the movements and the immediacy that's being taken place from one event to the other. How many times he uses connected words, and this happened, and that happened, and this happened, and that happened. Mark, there is a purpose that Jesus has come for, to serve us, mankind, for sure. But he comes as a servant of God as well, and he's always about that business. And as you read through the Gospel of Mark, look for these tendencies, these movements, the theme, and how often it's being brought forward, what's being asked of us as well. One of the tools that we priests use in preparing for homilies is what we call Lectio Divina. Some are familiar with that. We'll be discussing a little bit more in depth on that in one of the later sessions on these Saturday mornings. But it is the ability to read through a passage, put yourself in that passage, movement, and for Mark it happens pretty fast. What are the surroundings? What person are you in that scene? What's taking place? What's the weather? All of those things. Take time to embrace and sit, read through that section, the gospel. Get a feel for it. Read through it again. Maybe there's something that's speaking to you in that sense. Read through it a third time. Once you have that ingrained, this whole episode that's taking place or event, then to close your eyes and place yourself and just let that play out. Allow the Spirit to guide you where it will. I think you'll be amazed at where that takes you sometimes. Mark's Gospel, I think it was bringing forth again his themes. Not only of us acknowledging Jesus as the Son of God, but how we live that in our lives. We're called to be his followers, the immediacy that's being asked of us. Go forth and spread this good news to all whom we encounter. We'll open it up for any questions that you guys may have at this time. Again, there's so much richness there. If you start to read through there, you can start to see Mark loves to use the number 3, which is important. 3 times this happened. Peter denies 3 times. 3 times this, 3 times that. So many different things. Very, very rich, even though it's such a short gospel. Hopefully this gives you a little bit of introduction to it. As you guys read through it and study and meditate on its word, to give you a little bit of direction in that sense. Questions? Did you find it helpful? Anything you didn't know that you learned today? That's the one thing I always say is I hope that you walk away with just something that you didn't know before or some tidbit of information that will help you to break open the gospel in maybe a different lens or a different light. So, thank you all for coming this morning. Next week we will be talking about the Psalms. That'll be a little bit longer presentation because I unpack a few different things there and just how those Psalm prayers really can become our prayers too, different times of our lives. Thank you for coming this morning.